It is said that when Mongols entered the Abbasid capital of Baghdad in 1258, the city's libraries were burned, the scholars were slaughtered, and the rivers choked with the ink of books and the blood of innocents. This narrative, repeated in textbooks and documentaries, portrays the fall of Baghdad as the point of no return for the intellectual and cultural legacy of the Muslim world. But this popular story is both incomplete and misleading. While the siege of Baghdad was undoubtedly a tragedy, it did not represent the end of Islamic civilization, nor was it the most devastating event of the Mongol campaigns. In fact, Persian cities like Nishapur and Herat witnessed a far greater destruction. And contrary to what is often claimed, Baghdad actually recovered within decades and continued to play an important role in the Islamic world. Professor Frank Griffel, in his recently published book, says, "With its 6-day plunder and bloodshed, Baghdad was subject to much less violence than Nishapur or Herat." He also says that less than 1 month after the conquest, the governor of Baghdad, Ata Malik al-Juwaini, made strong efforts to restore and rebuild Baghdad and its institutions of learning. For instance, the Mustansiriya Madrasa reopened 1 year later after the destruction. In a recent study, Michael Byron shows that soon after the conquest, Muslims from Mamluk lands came to study in Baghdad, where libraries were well functioning. As far as Baghdad is concerned, the Mongol conquest neither introduced nor accelerated the decline of Islamic civilization or culture. Let's take a look at few examples of the scholarly activity in the later decades and centuries following the destruction of Baghdad. According to Professor George Saliba, the golden age of Islamic astronomy actually begins after the 11th century and reaches its peak in the 17th century. Mathematicians like Ibn al-Shatir, al-Tusi, Kutubuddin Shirazi, and al-Urmavi were influential not just in the Muslim world till the 18th century, but they also revolutionized Western sciences. Professor Morrison, in his new book, Merchants of Knowledge, talks about how Muslim astronomers of the 14th and 15th centuries produced astronomical and mathematical works of the highest caliber, and how their works were read and studied by Western astronomers like Copernicus via Jewish merchant families who brought the works of these Muslim scientists to Europe. Muslim scholarly network flourished in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries and even beyond, and numerous high-caliber texts on logic, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine were written in this period. Professor Asad Ahmad talks about the exponential growth in the number of logic texts written by scholars in this period. This scholarly network spanned across Western and South Asia and also reached North Africa. It was also heavily funded by the states. Some of the biggest logicians, mathematicians, and philosophers belong to this era, whether it's Atir al-Din al-Abhari, Najm al-Din al-Katibi, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, Siraj al-Din al-Urmavi, Sa'd al-Din al-Taftazani, Sayyid Sharif Jurjani, Ibn al-Shatir, Kutubuddin Shirazi, and many, many more. Lastly, these were not lonely philosophers writing books while hiding from the orthodoxy. These were celebrity scholars who were funded by the state. So, why then has the destruction of Baghdad become the emblem of decline? Part of the reason lies in its symbolism. The fall of the Abbasid Caliph, the putative head of the Ummah, resonated deeply in Islamic historical memory. Furthermore, 19th century European Orientalists such as Hegel and Renan cast the Islamic world in a framework of irreversible decline, linking the fall of Baghdad with the end of rational inquiry and the so-called death of Islamic philosophy. This Eurocentric framework proved immensely influential and contributed to a distorted chronology that saw Islamic civilization peaking in the 12th century before collapsing in the 13th. But modern scholars like Frank Griffel have challenged this view, showing that Islamic philosophy and theology not only continued after the Mongols, but in many ways flourished, particularly in Iran, Anatolia, and India. For instance, the Maragh Observatory, established by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi in 1259, exemplifies how Mongol patronage, once responsible for destruction, could also become a catalyst for scientific and philosophical innovations. Baghdad, far from disappearing, adapted and persisted within this new imperial framework. In conclusion, while the fall of Baghdad remains a powerful symbol of rupture, it should not be mistaken for a civilizational endpoint. The narrative of decline, shaped by colonial historiography and romantic imagery, overlooks both the scale of destruction in Central Asia and the subsequent resilience and adaptability of Islamic societies. The Mongol invasions were devastating, but they did not bring an end to Islamic thought. Instead, they reshaped its geography and redirected its currents, leading not to silence, but to reinvention.